Okay, so here's lesson 2I. It's based on the hemispheres of the brain and split brain research. So we'll be starting with letter F, the brain's hemispheres. And first we'll talk a little bit about the left hemisphere and some of its responsibilities. Before I do, let me just say that these differences tend to be exaggerated, actually, because the two hemispheres talk to one another so much by a structure that we're going to refer to later in this discussion as the corpus callosum. Because the two hemispheres talk to each other so much, the differences are minimized. I think that some of us have a preference to go to one hemisphere before the other, but because both hemispheres talk to each other so much and have always done that since you were born, then it's something that has minimized these differences. But let's go through the left hemisphere and some of the basics you're going to see. So first of all, the first two are the most important. So if you want to maybe star them or highlight them or underline them. First of all, the left hemisphere is responsible for letter A, and that's movement on the right side of the body. Okay, so my ability to do this is my left hemisphere. Okay, it's called contralateralization. So, and that is that one hemisphere controls the other side of the body. Letter B is language. That the left hemisphere is where language is found in nearly all of us. So those two are really the most important parts, just like we talked about last unit, that Broca's area and Wernicke's area are only found in the left hemisphere, right? Some other interesting tidbits. For letter C, you can put the word logical. For letter D, sequential. For letter E, structured. And that should be a lowercase f. I'll have to fix that. Planners. Okay, so left hemisphere people tend to be people that do things because it makes sense to do them. They tend to be logical when they do a job. They tend to prep for it, effectively do the job step by step. Okay, they don't jump around, and then they are very conscientious about the cleanup or the after. So even in my class, for example, people who are more geared towards their left hemisphere, when they take a test, they're going to be very cognizant of putting the correct things on the scantrons and making sure that the piles are right when they turn the tests in and that type of thing. Okay. The right hemisphere then, move myself over. Obviously, if the left hemisphere is responsible for the right side of the body, the right hemisphere is responsible, and this is your small a, for the left side of the body. And just like on the left, you can highlight or underline that. Where the left hemisphere is responsible for language, the right hemisphere is responsible for nonverbal communication. Okay, so that'll be B. Another thing that the right hemisphere tends to be is more intuitive. So when making decisions, they'll go with their gut because they'll say things because it felt right. So C would be intuitive. D is holistic. It's kind of an interesting thing or viewpoint, but you'll see this later how this works. The left hemisphere focuses on details, and the right hemisphere sees the big picture. Okay, so for example, I'm right hemisphere dominant. I'm someone who tends to go right first. And I've had many times in my life, I've had people say that you're a big picture person, which lines up perfectly with that. Okay. Well, again, we'll come back to that a little bit more. So letter E then would be spatial. That's SPATIAL or visual spatial. And let's highlight or put a star next to this one because this is probably the equivalent of the language to the left hemisphere. So what we mean by visual spatial is that they see things really well in space. So they can interpret what's going on. For example, my wife's grandma had a stroke a while back, and we were on the way to see her, and I was curious. I'm like, do you know where the stroke occurred? And I had all these questions, and she was kind of bothered because I was curious about the stroke and I wanted to be ready for what I might see. And when we got to the hospital, she seemed pretty good. And so the stroke was mild, but I couldn't pick up which hemisphere it was in, because when a person has a stroke, it tends to happen in one hemisphere. So, and then the phone rang, and what happened was, we'll pretend that this glass is the phone. When she reached for the phone, she missed it. And then when she reached again, she missed it again. And I realized right then and there that the stroke happened in her right hemisphere, because it messed up her ability to process things that were happening in space. Okay. And then F will say that they tend to be spontaneous. So this is the opposite of lefties being planners. Okay. So if you're someone who wants to have plans, loves to have plans on a Saturday night, you're probably more left hemisphere, whereas someone who would just as soon see what happens is probably more right. Okay. Another story about the left hemisphere and language. My wife and I at one time walked into a restaurant before COVID, and it was breakfast, and there were a couple tables open, and we were standing there, and I noticed a guy that was really, really struggling with his right side of his body. And the waitress said, "Which table would you prefer?" And I pointed at the one that was next to that guy, because I was curious about whether or not he had language. Because again, if he was struggling with his right hand, that meant that the stroke happened in his left hemisphere, which could very easily mean that he had language difficulties. So he was eating by himself, and then eventually the waitress came over and said, "Can I get you anything else?" And he said, and I was like, boom, bingo. And my wife said, "Is that why you wanted to sit here?" And I said, "Yeah." So there you have it. Okay, so those are the two hemispheres. I have to do this again because I moved the thing. Whenever I move myself, I have to go to slide. Isn't that interesting? So I'm going to have to go to slide again on the next one. All right, so how do we know these things? As far as AP Psych goes, this is the more important part, versus understanding what hemisphere is responsible for what. It's more important to know why we know this. Okay, how do we find this out? And this came from something we call split brain research. And I'm actually, I guess it did work. That's weird. Okay. I am actually going to take a second and add a couple names, because these are your first names. I don't know if I put them in. Anywhere else. So it's important that we know this. So, and I'm also going to put an equal sign, because we need to know about not only these people, but also this term. So there we go. So split brain research comes from two psychologists named Gazzaniga and Sperry. You're actually going to see Gazzaniga in your 2J video. And split brain research is research that has been done on split brain patients that has taught us about the two hemispheres of the brain. Okay, research that has been done on split brain patients that has taught us about the two hemispheres of the brain. In order to understand the research, we have to understand a brain structure called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is the fibers, kind of like this, that connect the two hemispheres of the brain. So you might remember when we did this to make our brain, the fibers would somehow connect that together, if I could do it like that. Okay. So the corpus callosum are fibers that connect the two hemispheres of the brain. Interesting tidbit about these is that women's corpus callosums are thicker than men's. And we think that this is the case because way, way, way back when, in evolutionary times, our ancestors, when our ancestors were roaming around, males were pretty much right hemisphere dominant, and they didn't use their left hemisphere very much, because they basically, all they had to do was hunt and gather, me hunt, me gather, me hunt, me gather. So what they were doing was they were using their visual spatial skills to try to judge distance and to understand place, so that they would know where, if they found food one day, how to get back there the next day. Whereas women were probably using or females were probably using both hemispheres more than men, and that built that corpus callosum up. So if you understand evolutionary psychology, you'll understand that the corpus callosum's difference is going to minimize over time, hopefully, because hopefully males are using both hemispheres just as much as females today, and that'll minimize that difference. Okay. So I mentioned that split brain research involves split brain patients, and split brain patients are people who had their corpus callosums removed because of epilepsy. Okay. So if a person has epilepsy, the number one symptom is seizures, right? So what happens is that a seizure starts in the brain and then spreads. And if it becomes a severe seizure, it'll spread to across the corpus callosum to the entire brain. And then that'll be a really bad seizure, right? So what they thought in the 60s and 70s and 80s was we need to minimize these seizures. So they cut the corpus callosum. Today, they use a different form of surgery. You don't see this very often, but that's what they did. There were two effects that resulted from these surgeries, okay? Short-term effects, which STFX, right? And long-term effects, LTFX. So the short-term effects of the split brain patients, and the reason I have a star there is because we went Roman numeral, capital, number, lowercase i's. So this is how we do this, okay? The short-term effects were really interesting. The split brain patients had severe difficulties making decisions. So you would have people who all of them almost reported struggling picking out their clothes. Whenever they went to pick out clothes, the left hand would grab one set of clothes that the right hemisphere wanted to wear, and the right hand would grab a different set of clothes that the left hemisphere wanted to wear, and they would sit there and struggle with these clothes until one hand finally threw down the clothes. So basically, it was basically like they were living with two separate brains, two separate personalities almost. And again, we aren't like that because the two hemispheres communicate, so they probably compromise and come up with different conclusions and decisions based on those compromises. But these people didn't have that communication device anymore. So this was the problem that they had. One guy, if you remember, if you had me for regular psych, you might remember that one guy picked up a book and wanted to read it, and the left hand knocked the book right out of his hand because the right hemisphere didn't want to read. Because remember, language is in the left, right? So the person picked it up with their right hand to start reading it, and the left hand knocked it out because the left hemisphere wanted to read, but the right hemisphere didn't. So again, fortunately, those were short-term effects, okay? That would have really sucked for them to live their entire life like that. The long-term effects, or the LTFX, were basically none. These people, you'll see it in the video, this guy's doing fine. He's not having any problems. That in part, and we're going to talk about plasticity later, but that in part is due to the brain's plasticity, its ability to overcome injury and difficulties, among other things. And because the two hemispheres were talking, it was like they were doing the work naturally. Okay, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about plasticity. Okay, so that's the setup. All right, so there's Gazzaniga and Sperry. So the experiments by Gazzaniga and Sperry were prepared because they were confused by these long-term effects that these people seem to be doing so fine. And to be honest, they may have been a little disappointed that the brain didn't show these differences. So what they did then was they ran some experiments, okay, about this. And before I describe these experiments, I want to talk a little bit about vision, because you have to understand vision to understand the experiment. So originally, people thought that our right eye went to our left hemisphere and vice versa, which would make sense because the rest of our body does that. So it would only make sense that our eyes would be the same as our ears and our hands and everything else. But in fact, it's not the case. And the reason for that's really, really interesting. If you think about it, it's really, really important that when you see something, that information be sent to both hemispheres, and at the same time, because vision is probably the most important sense, right? In order to protect you in terms of a life or death situation. So what happens here is that if that were the case, if in fact the right hemisphere went to, I'm sorry, the right eye went to the left hemisphere and vice versa, that would mean that if we lost an eye, that if I lost my left eye, for example, information that went to my right eye would go to my left hemisphere, and then that information would go to my right using the corpus callosum, and then my right hemisphere would know what was going on. So for example, if I needed to use my left hand in defense of something, okay, and my right eye saw what was coming at me, all right, that means it would go to my left hemisphere, and then my left would tell my right, raise your left hand and bat it away or block it or something like that. And that would take a split second longer than it would on this side, if you're following me, right? Because if it went to my right eye and it went to my left hemisphere, I'd be quicker here. Well, we can't afford this. We need every second we can get in a life or death situation. So the way our eyes are actually laid out is, instead of the right eye going to the left hemisphere and the left eye going to the right hemisphere, the right half of each eye goes to the left hemisphere, and the left half of each eye goes to the right hemisphere. So that way, if I lose an eye and I see something with my right eye, both hemispheres see it equally and I can respond. Not only that, but if I have to respond with both my hands in conjunction together, right, and one hemisphere sees it before the other, there's going to be a mix-up, okay? So I won't be able to catch a ball necessarily as well, or something like that. So our eyes are split in half, if you will. They're not actually split in half, but visually, we have a right visual field and we have a left visual field. The right visual field goes to the left hemisphere. The left visual field goes to the right hemisphere, okay? So with that background as the understanding, let me explain the experiments, okay? And again, you're gonna be reading your 5 steps about this, and the video is gonna help as well, so I really hope you get an understanding for this. But so if a dog is flashed to the right visual field, okay, that's what these blue lines represent. That information goes to the left hemisphere. And by the way, let me back up. I'm jumping ahead. So this is the experiment that was done on the people with the split brain surgery. And what they were told to do is they were told to focus on a cross in the middle of the screen. Again, you'll see that in the video. Whoops, I pressed screen. So you'll be able to see how this works in the video that you watch after this. But the dog will go to the left hemisphere of the brain, and the person will say, I saw a dog. No big deal, just like we would expect. However, when the cat was flashed to the left visual field, that's represented in red, it would go to the right hemisphere. And they asked the person what they saw, and they said, I don't know. So they could say what they saw in the right visual field, but they couldn't say what they saw in the left. And some of you know the answer to this because you remember what we just mentioned about the left hemisphere, that the left hemisphere is responsible for language. So what happens is this dog goes to the left hemisphere and Broca's area says, dog. Well, remember, Broca's area is only in the left hemisphere. So when the cat goes to the right hemisphere, it can't cross over to get to the left because these people have had their corpus callosums cut, right? You and I wouldn't have this problem. And you and I, the cat would go to the right hemisphere would tell the left, and the left would say cat, okay? But if you don't have a corpus callosum, that information can't get transferred over. So this cat was stuck in the right hemisphere, if you will. Then it gets really interesting, though, because then what they would do is they would tell the person, even though the person said, I don't know what I saw, because that's what all language, because that's basically true. They're not lying. The left hemisphere doesn't know. They would tell the person, okay, draw what you saw with your left hand. And then the person would take their left hand and they would draw a cat. And their left hemisphere would be watching them draw the cat and figure out, oh, that was a cat. It's a lot like Pictionary. If you've ever played Pictionary, these people would play Pictionary with themselves, where the right hemisphere would use the left hand to draw the picture, and the left hemisphere would have to guess what it was. Quite interesting, right? Now, as far as the dog goes, going back to the dog, as soon as the left hemisphere says dog, the right hemisphere will hear it in the left ear and hear what it was, right? So the right hemisphere knows. So the left hemisphere can communicate for these people to the right hemisphere verbally, but the right hemisphere has to communicate visually by drawing something. Okay. All right. So if you do this experiment, this one is another classic in the research. If you flash the word heart, okay, to the person, here they focus on the cross, and I'm on this third to the right with the actual brain. So the word he goes to the right hemisphere. The word art goes to the left. So the left hemisphere would say, I saw the word art, because the word he went to the right and it's stuck there. If you look on this bottom right image, if you gave this person a sheet of paper with the word he and the word art and said, which word did you see? Notice the person's left hand is pointing to the word he, right? So he is in the left visual field, so it goes to the right hemisphere, and they can point to that with their left hand. The word art goes to the right visual field, and therefore the left hemisphere, and the person will verbalize art. Okay? All right. Here's another interesting thing that they did with this experiment. They flashed this symbol to both hemispheres. The left hemisphere said it's a bunch of S's. The right hemisphere said it's a W, or drew a W. Okay, and this exemplifies exactly what we mean when we talk about the differences in the two hemispheres, that the left hemisphere looks for details. So when the left hemisphere sees this, it just sees S's. It doesn't see a pattern. It just sees S's. Okay. The right hemisphere, however, doesn't see the S's. It just sees the pattern. Okay. It's taking the holistic big picture spatial view, right? And that's what's going on here. All right. Okay. Now I'm not going to put a picture of a naked person on this presentation, but if they flashed an image of a naked person to the left visual field, the person would be like, oh, and they would start laughing. And then they said, what are you laughing at? And the person would be like, I don't know. I don't know why I'm laughing. Because the left hemisphere doesn't know what the right hemisphere saw. Get it? Okay. So the next video, the 2J video, is a video of the experiment occurring, and you can actually see this played out. And then the last experiment that they run should make sense as well. It's a really good way to understand basically the same concept of this. Okay? Enjoy.